I was 19 when everything changed. But it wasn't graduation, college, or freedom. It was a phone call that felt like a death sentence. 3 elders summoning me to a secret tribunal behind the doors of the Kingdom Hall. What happened in that windowless room was the beginning of a forbidden path that nearly shattered my entire life. I was 19 years old when my life changed forever, but not in the way most 19-year-olds imagine their lives changing. There was no graduation party, no college acceptance letter, no first apartment keys jingling in my pocket. Instead, there was a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The kind of call that makes your stomach drop before you even hear the words. Emily, the elders would like to speak with you after tonight's meeting. Sister Margaret's voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize since childhood. The one that meant trouble was coming. The one that meant someone had been watching, taking notes, preparing judgment. I set the receiver back in its cradle with trembling fingers, staring at the avocado green kitchen phone that had just delivered what felt like a death sentence. My name is Emily Richardson, and I grew up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone else's business, especially when that business involved stepping outside the carefully drawn lines of acceptable behavior. At 19, I had never been on a real date, never been to a school dance, never celebrated a birthday or Christmas. My entire world revolved around 3 weekly meetings at the Kingdom Hall, door-to-door preaching every Saturday morning, and the constant underlying anxiety of never being quite good enough for Jehovah's approval. Our Kingdom Hall sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, a simple rectangular building with beige siding and narrow windows that never seemed to let in enough light. Inside, the carpet was that industrial brown color that hides stains, and the air always smelled like coffee and the faint mustiness of old songbooks. Rows of metal folding chairs faced a small platform where elders delivered talks about the coming paradise and the destruction that would precede it. I lived with my parents in a modest ranch house, 4 blocks from the hall, close enough that we walked to meetings unless the weather was particularly harsh. My father, Robert, worked at the local paper mill and served as a ministerial servant in the congregation. My mother, Linda, was a regular pioneer who spent 70 hours each month knocking on doors, carrying her worn leather book bag and a smile that had grown increasingly strained over the years. Our daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. Every morning began with family worship around our kitchen table. A wooden table my father had built himself, sturdy and simple, surrounded by 4 matching chairs with cushions my mother had sewn from fabric remnants. We'd read a few verses from the day's text, discuss how to apply the spiritual food to our lives, and pray for strength to remain faithful in Satan's wicked world. Tuesday and Thursday evenings were reserved for meetings. Sunday mornings meant field service followed by the public talk and watchtower study. Saturday mornings were for door-to-door work in our assigned territory, walking tree-lined streets with names like Oak Avenue and Cedar Drive, approaching modest homes where curtains would twitch closed when residents spotted us coming up their front walks. The phone call that Tuesday afternoon wasn't entirely unexpected. For weeks, I'd been aware of whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, of meaningful glances exchanged between the elders' wives, of my mother's increasingly frequent sighs and worried looks in my direction. You see, there had been a situation, the kind of situation that threatens the carefully maintained reputation of a young woman in our community. His name was Michael, and he was 22, recently returned from serving as a full-time minister in a neighboring state. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, kind eyes, and a way of talking about spiritual things that made them seem less like burdens and more like invitations. We'd spoken after meetings, shared meaningful looks across the Kingdom Hall, and eventually we'd spent time alone together. Innocent time, but alone nonetheless. In the world I grew up in, even innocent time alone between unmarried young people was considered dangerous, a threat to both their purity and their standing in the congregation. Someone had seen us walking together by the small pond behind the elementary school. Someone had noticed that we'd arrived at a regional assembly in the same car. Someone always noticed everything in our small, tight-knit community where privacy was a luxury few could afford. That evening, I dressed carefully in a navy blue skirt that fell well below my knees and a white blouse with sleeves that covered my wrists, even though the March evening was warmer than usual. My mother brushed my shoulder-length brown hair and pinned it back with simple bobby pins. Her hands gentle, but her face tense with worry. She knew why the elders wanted to speak with me, just as I knew. Just as everyone in our congregation probably knew by now. "Remember, Emily," she whispered as we gathered our meeting bags, "always show respect for Jehovah's arrangement. The elders only want what's best for you." The Kingdom Hall felt different that night. The same brown carpet, the same narrow windows, the same smell of coffee and old books, but somehow the air felt thicker, heavier with unspoken judgment. I sat through the Theocratic Ministry School meeting, barely hearing the student presentations, my attention focused instead on the three elders who would soon decide my fate. Brother Williams, a stern man with silver hair who owned the town's only hardware store, Brother Chen, younger but equally serious, who worked as a bank manager, and Brother Davidson, the congregation's presiding overseer, a man whose gentle smile had always made me feel safe until now. After the closing prayer, most of the congregation filtered out into the parking lot, chatting quietly about weekend plans and upcoming circuit assemblies. But I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching as my parents exchanged worried glances and made their way toward the exit. My mother paused at the door, looking back with eyes that held both love and helplessness, before my father gently guided her outside. "Emily, would you join us in the back room, please?" Brother Davidson's voice was kind but firm, the same tone he used when counseling publishers about their field service reports or addressing minor infractions of congregational guidelines. I stood on unsteady legs and followed the three men toward the small office behind the platform, a windowless room with a single fluorescent light, a desk, and 4 chairs arranged in what suddenly felt like an interrogation setup. The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded as final as a prison gate. "Emily," Brother Williams began, his hands clasped on the desk before him. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention regarding your conduct with Brother Michael Stevens." The walls of that small room seemed to press closer with each word, and I realized that at 19 years old, surrounded by men more than twice my age, I was about to hear a decision that would reshape the trajectory of my entire life. What I didn't realize was that this moment, sitting in that airless room facing those solemn faces, was only the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead me far from everything I'd ever known, toward a freedom I couldn't yet imagine. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of car engines starting and the muffled conversations of families heading home to their normal Tuesday evening routines. But inside that room, time seemed suspended, waiting for words that would either restore my place in the only community I'd ever known or cast me into the terrifying unknown beyond its protective walls. The three men who sat across from me in that small room represented everything I had been taught to respect since childhood. Brother Williams, with his weathered hands and silver hair, had baptized me when I was 12 years old in the cold waters of Miller's Creek, speaking gentle words about dedicating my life to Jehovah. Brother Chen, serious and methodical, had given me my first student assignment in the Theocratic Ministry School, patiently helping me prepare my 5-minute presentation about Hannah's prayer. Brother Davidson, our presiding overseer, had visited our family during my father's brief hospitalization 3 years earlier, bringing magazines and offering prayers that had comforted my mother during those anxious nights. These were good men, I told myself as I settled into the metal folding chair they'd positioned facing their makeshift tribunal. Men who had families of their own, who worked honest jobs, who spent their evenings studying Watchtower publications and their weekends walking door to door in uncomfortable dress shoes, sharing what they believed was life-saving truth with disinterested neighbors. They weren't cruel or vindictive. They were simply doing what they believed was right, following the organizational guidelines they'd been given for handling situations like mine. "Emily," Brother Davidson began, his voice carrying the same gentle authority I'd heard during his talks from the Kingdom Hall platform. "We've received some concerns about your spending time alone with Brother Stevens. Can you tell us about your relationship with him?" I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind dozens of times over the past few weeks, ever since I'd noticed the meaningful glances and hushed conversations that followed Michael and me wherever we went. I'd prepared careful explanations about our innocent friendship, our shared interest in spiritual things, our similar ages making natural conversation easy. But sitting there, under the weight of their collective gaze, my carefully planned words scattered like leaves in autumn wind. "We've talked," I managed, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "After meetings, sometimes during field service. He's been helping me understand some of the deeper prophetic scriptures." Brother Williams nodded slowly, making a note on the yellow legal pad that lay open before him. The sound of his pen scratching against paper seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. On the wall behind them hung a framed print of Jesus knocking at a door, the same image that appeared on countless watchtower covers, his expression kind, but somehow distant in the fluorescent lighting. "Emily, you're 19 years old now," Brother Chen interjected, his banker's precision evident in every word. "That's an age when young people need to be especially careful about their associations. The Bible warns us about the dangers of following our hearts instead of wisdom." I knew the scripture he was referencing without him quoting it. Jeremiah 17:9. "The heart is more treacherous than anything else and is desperate." I'd heard it applied to situations like mine many times before, usually during parts on the Theocratic Ministry School about courtship and marriage, delivered by married brothers who spoke with authority about temptations they claimed to understand. My own heart felt anything but treacherous as I thought about Michael. He had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and a way of explaining Bible prophecies that made complex chronologies seem like fascinating stories rather than dry calculations. When he talked about the paradise earth we were all hoping to inherit, his face lit up with genuine enthusiasm that made me believe, for the first time in years, that it might actually be a place I'd want to live. "Brother Stevens is a fine young man," Brother Davidson continued, "and we're not suggesting there's been any impropriety. But the appearance of things matters, Emily. The Apostle Paul counseled us to abstain from every form of evil. Not just evil itself, but even the appearance of evil." The appearance of evil. That phrase had governed so much of my life already. It was the reason I couldn't take violin lessons like I dreamed of as a child. The instructor was a man, and private music lessons might appear inappropriate. It was why I declined a scholarship to the state university. Higher education beyond what was necessary for basic employment might appear to show lack of faith in the nearness of Armageddon. It was why I dressed in skirts that covered my knees, even during summer heat waves, why I wore my hair long, even though shorter styles were more comfortable, why I carried myself with the careful modesty that marked all young witness women as different from their worldly peers. Now it seemed that even friendship, innocent, spiritual friendship with someone who shared my faith and my values, fell under the shadow of that same phrase. The appearance of evil was becoming the appearance of everything. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. Brother Williams set down his pen and folded his hands, a gesture I recognized from countless judicial meetings I'd heard about, but never experienced firsthand. It was the pose he assumed when delivering serious counsel, the same position he'd taken 3 years earlier when speaking to Sister Martinez about her son's association with worldly classmates. "Emily, at your age, spending time alone with a young brother like Michael naturally leads people to wonder about your intentions. Are you courting? Are you planning to marry? If not, then why are you spending time together in ways that could lead to romantic feelings?" The logic was circular but unassailable within the framework I'd been raised in. Young men and women didn't spend time together unless they were seriously considering marriage. Serious consideration of marriage required parental involvement and elder oversight. Parental involvement meant my father and mother would need to approve of the relationship. Elder oversight meant these three men would need to determine whether Michael and I were spiritually compatible and ready for the responsibilities of Christian marriage. But Michael and I had never discussed marriage. We'd barely progressed beyond conversations about Bible chronology and field service experiences. The most intimate moment we'd shared was sitting on the wooden bench by Miller's Creek, watching ducks paddle through water that reflected the early spring sky while we discussed what paradise might look like. He'd mentioned hoping there would still be seasons in the new world, that the changing leaves and first spring flowers were too beautiful to disappear forever. I'd agreed, adding that I hoped there would still be morning coffee, that the ritual of grinding beans and waiting for the pot to brew felt too peaceful to be eliminated from perfection. It had been a conversation about eternal things, about hope and beauty and the future we'd been promised since childhood. But I could see now how it might appear to someone watching from a distance. Two young people alone together, sitting close enough to speak quietly, sharing thoughts too personal for public discussion. "Brother Davidson," I said carefully, "Michael and I haven't talked about marriage. We're just friends. We enjoy talking about spiritual things." "But Emily," Brother Chen replied, "at your age, friendships between brothers and sisters naturally develop into something more serious unless they're carefully supervised. That's human nature. That's why the organization provides guidelines for young people about courtship." The guidelines. I knew them by heart, had heard them repeated in talks and assemblies since I was old enough to understand. Young witnesses didn't date casually like worldly people. They didn't spend time getting to know multiple potential partners. Instead, when a young man was interested in a young woman, he approached her father first, explaining his intentions and asking permission to begin a supervised courtship. The couple would spend time together only in groups or under family supervision. They would discuss their spiritual goals, their plans for serving Jehovah, their readiness to establish a Christian household. If both sets of parents and the elders agreed they were compatible, they would become engaged after a relatively short courtship period and marry quickly thereafter. It was a system designed to prevent the complications and heartbreak that the organization thought were inevitable results of worldly dating. Young people would enter marriage with clear expectations, strong spiritual foundations, and family support. They would avoid the sexual temptation that came with prolonged dating relationships. They would follow the pattern established in Bible times, when marriages were arranged by families and young people trusted their parents' wisdom rather than following their own potentially deceptive hearts. But sitting in that room, facing the logical conclusion of those guidelines, I realized I wasn't ready for any of it. I wasn't ready to have my father negotiating with Michael's father about my future. I wasn't ready to begin a supervised courtship with all its formal expectations and predetermined timeline. I wasn't ready to plan a wedding, establish a household, become a wife and potential mother, while I was still trying to figure out who I was as an individual. And yet, the alternative being presented to me was equally impossible. I could either pursue a serious courtship with Michael immediately, or I could end our friendship completely and return to the carefully supervised social interactions that characterized single life in our community. There was no middle ground. No space for the kind of gradual relationship development that might allow us to discover whether we were truly compatible. "Emily," Brother Davidson said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need you to make a decision. Either you're ready to begin a proper courtship with Brother Stevens, with your parents' involvement and our oversight, or you need to limit your association with him to appropriate group settings. Continuing as you have been isn't fair to either of you, and it's causing concern in the congregation." I looked around that small room, taking in the details I'd never noticed before during the brief times I'd been inside it for cleaning assignments. The industrial carpet was wearing thin near the door where countless feet had entered for judicial meetings, appeals, and serious discussions. The single window was too high to see out of unless you stood on a chair, offering only a narrow rectangle of sky that seemed impossibly distant. On the desk sat a well-worn copy of the Elder's Manual, its cover cracked from use, containing procedures and guidelines for every aspect of congregational life. This room was where decisions were made about who could get married, who could get divorced, who could be reinstated after being disfellowshipped, who could serve in positions of responsibility within the congregation. It was where the course of individual lives was determined by men who meant well, but who operated within a system that left little room for personal autonomy or gradual discovery. The silence stretched between us as I tried to formulate an answer that would preserve my relationship with Michael while avoiding the immediate pressure of formal courtship. But there was no such answer within the framework I'd been given. The organizational structure was clear and non-negotiable. Either I was ready to begin the process that led to marriage, or I needed to step back and wait until I was ready. "I need time to think," I finally said, the words feeling inadequate but representing the only honesty I could manage in that moment. Brother Williams nodded slowly. "We understand this is a big decision, Emily Wan, but we can't let the current situation continue indefinitely. Why don't you take until Sunday to think it over? After the meeting this weekend, we'll need your answer." The 3 days between Thursday night and Sunday's expected answer stretched like an eternity. I walked through my familiar routines, helping my mother prepare meals in our small kitchen with its yellow-flowered wallpaper, organizing the magazines for Saturday's field service, pressing my meeting clothes. But everything felt different, as if I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. Friday morning brought the first real conversation I'd had with my parents about what the elders had discussed with me. We sat around our wooden breakfast table, the same table where we'd shared family worship every morning for as long as I could remember, but the atmosphere felt strained, careful, as if we were all trying not to break something fragile. "Emily," my father said, spreading strawberry jam on his toast with deliberate precision. "Brother Davidson called me yesterday. He said you need time to think about your relationship with Brother Stevens." My mother kept her eyes fixed on her coffee cup, a simple white mug with a small chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away for years. The morning sunlight streaming through our kitchen window illuminated the tiny dust motes floating between us, and I found myself focusing on them instead of meeting my father's gaze. "Michael is a good young man," I said carefully. "But I don't know if I'm ready for courtship." The words felt strange in my mouth. For weeks, I'd been trying to understand my own feelings about Michael, about the way my heart seemed to skip when he smiled during his comments at the Watchtower study, about how I found myself looking forward to the moments when our paths would cross after meetings. But sitting in that kitchen, under my parents' watchful concern, those feelings seemed both more important and less significant than I'd imagined. "Emily," my mother said softly, finally looking up from her coffee. 19 is a perfectly appropriate age for a young sister to begin thinking about marriage. When I was your age, I'd already been married to your father for 6 months." That was true. My parents had met at a circuit assembly, begun a 3-month courtship under their family's supervision, and married in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall when my mother was 19 and my father 21. They'd established their small household, begun their family, built their life around the organization's schedule and expectations. It was the pattern I'd been raised to expect for myself. But somehow, sitting there in the pale morning light, that pattern felt like a coat that didn't quite fit. Not wrong exactly, but uncomfortable in ways I couldn't articulate. "I know, Mom," I replied. "It's just, I want to be sure. Marriage is such a big step." My father nodded approvingly. "It is a big step, which is why we have the arrangement for proper courtship. That's how young people can know if they're truly compatible before making such an important commitment." The arrangement. Everything in our community had an arrangement. A proper way of doing things that had been carefully thought out by the organization's leadership and passed down through generations of faithful witnesses. There was an arrangement for conducting meetings, an arrangement for field service, an arrangement for family life, an arrangement for courtship and marriage. The arrangements were supposed to make life simpler, clearer, more pleasing to Jehovah. But as Friday dissolved into Friday evening, and I sat through the Theocratic Ministry school meeting listening to student presentations about building faith and showing love for neighbors, I found myself wondering if arrangements always served the people living within them, or if sometimes people were expected to reshape themselves to fit the arrangements instead. Saturday morning brought the familiar ritual of field service preparation. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my navy blue dress and pinning back my hair with simple bobby pins. Watching myself perform the same routine I'd followed every Saturday morning since I was old enough to participate in door-to-door work. But my reflections seemed like a stranger's. The same brown eyes, the same pale complexion, the same careful modesty in dress and demeanor, but somehow fundamentally changed by questions I couldn't stop asking. Our field service group met at the Kingdom Hall at 9 o'clock sharp. Brother Chen, who was serving as the field service overseer that morning, assigned territories and paired publishers for the morning's work. I found myself paired with Sister Martha, a woman in her 50s who had been pioneering for over 20 years and who had a gentle way of talking to householders that made even rejected presentations feel like successful encounters. "Emily, dear," she said as we walked toward our assigned territory in the Riverside neighborhood, "Brother Chen mentioned that you might be entering a courtship soon. How exciting for you." The assumption in her voice, not whether I would enter courtship, but when, made my stomach tighten. Word traveled fast in our small congregation, especially when it involved young people and potential romantic relationships. By Sunday, everyone would expect to hear an announcement about Michael and me beginning formal courtship procedures. "Nothing's definite yet," I said, trying to keep my voice light as we approached the first house on our list, a modest ranch home with a well-maintained front yard and children's bicycles scattered on the driveway. Sister Martha rang the doorbell, and we waited, listening to the sounds of a television and children's voices inside. When the door opened, we were greeted by a tired-looking woman in her 30s holding a toddler who was clearly in the middle of a snack, his face smeared with something that looked like peanut butter and jelly. "Good morning," Sister Martha said with her practiced warmth. "We're visiting neighbors today to share some encouraging thoughts from the Bible. Do you ever wonder why there's so much suffering in the world, when most people are just trying to live good lives?" The woman shifted the toddler to her other hip and glanced back into the house, where the sounds of an argument between older children had begun to escalate. "You know," she said, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Saturday morning is just not a good time for our family. We're dealing with some challenging things right now." "Of course," Sister Martha replied. "We understand that families have busy schedules. Would you like us to leave you with a brief article about finding peace during difficult times?" The woman accepted the tract with a polite smile, thanked us, and closed the door gently. As we walked toward the next house, Sister Martha made a note on her field service record and commented, "She seemed like a nice person. Sometimes the best thing we can do is plant seeds and trust that Jehovah will make them grow when the time is right." But as we continued our morning's work, moving from house to house in that quiet neighborhood where children played in front yards and neighbors waved to each other across property lines, I found myself thinking about the woman with the peanut butter-faced toddler. She'd been dealing with challenging things. But what kind of challenges? Marriage problems? Financial stress? Children who were struggling in school or having behavior issues? And what kind of support system did she have to help her navigate those challenges? In our community, challenging times were addressed through prayer, Bible study, and consultation with the elders. Family problems were resolved by following biblical principles about headship and submission. Financial difficulties were met with trust in Jehovah's provision and careful adherence to organizational guidelines about education and career choices. Children's behavioral issues were handled through consistent discipline and increased spiritual instruction. But what if the challenges were more complex than our prescribed solutions could address? What if a marriage was destructive rather than merely difficult? What if children needed professional help that went beyond increased Bible study? What if financial problems stemmed from systemic issues that couldn't be solved through individual faithfulness? Emily, Sister Martha said as we approached our 5th house of the morning. "You seem very thoughtful today. Is everything all right?" I realized I'd been walking in relative silence for the past 15 minutes, barely participating in our between-house conversations about weather and weekend plans and the upcoming circuit assembly. "I'm fine," I said quickly, "just thinking about some personal things." She nodded understandingly. "Young people have so many decisions to make. When I was your age, it all seemed much simpler. You finished school, found a suitable young man in the congregation, got married, and started your life. Now there are so many more options, so many more things to consider. More options." That phrase stuck with me as we completed our morning's work and returned to the Kingdom Hall to turn in our field service reports. Were there really more options for young people like me? Or were we simply more aware of options that had always existed but had been discouraged or ignored? That afternoon, I found myself walking alone through Riverside Park, the same park where Michael and I had sat by the pond discussing paradise and eternal seasons. The late March air carried the first real warmth of spring, and the trees were beginning to show the pale green of new leaves. Families were scattered across the grass. Parents pushing children on swings, teenagers playing frisbee, elderly couples walking slowly along the paved paths that wound through the landscaped grounds. I sat on the bench where Michael and I had shared our conversation about morning coffee in paradise, watching a young family spread a picnic blanket near the pond. The parents looked to be in their mid-20s, and they had 2 small children who were fascinated by the ducks swimming near the shore. The mother was clearly pregnant with their 3rd child, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she watched her husband help their toddler throw pieces of bread into the water. They looked happy, content with their life together. But they also looked free in a way that I couldn't quite define. Free to make their own decisions about where to live, how to spend their weekends, what kind of education to pursue, what values to teach their children. Free to build their family's traditions and rhythms without consulting a body of elders or conforming to organizational expectations. What would my life look like if I married Michael according to the proper arrangement? We would begin our supervised courtship, spending time together only in group settings or under family oversight. We would discuss our spiritual goals, our commitment to the organization, our plans for serving Jehovah together. If the elders and our families approved of our compatibility, we would become engaged after a few months and marry quickly thereafter. Then what? We would establish our household according to biblical principles of headship and submission. Michael would make the major decisions about our life direction, career choices, family planning. I would support his decisions, maintain our home, participate in congregation activities as his wife rather than as an individual. We would raise our children to be faithful witnesses, carefully monitoring their associations, their education, their exposure to worldly influences. It was a good life, a secure life, a life that had worked well for thousands of witness families, including my own parents. But sitting on that bench, watching that young family enjoy their Saturday afternoon freedom, I realized I was terrified by how small that life suddenly seemed. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't ready for formal courtship with Michael because I wasn't ready for marriage at all. Not because I was too young. Plenty of 19-year-old witness women were ready and eager to begin their adult lives as wives and mothers. But because I had questions I wanted to explore, aspects of myself I wanted to discover, experiences I wanted to have that wouldn't be possible within the carefully defined boundaries of life as a married witness woman. But admitting that to myself created an immediate problem. If I wasn't ready for marriage, what was I ready for? The organization provided clear paths for young women: marriage and motherhood, or remaining single while pioneering and serving in other full-time capacities. There wasn't really a third option for women who wanted something different, something undefined, something that involved exploration and discovery, rather than immediate commitment to predetermined roles. Sunday morning brought the familiar preparation for our congregation's meeting. I dressed carefully in my best skirt and blouse, helped my mother prepare the simple lunch we would share between the public talk and the Watchtower study, reviewed the lesson material with the highlighted answers I'd prepared throughout the week. But underneath the familiar routine, anxiety hummed like electricity. After the meeting, I would need to give the elders my answer about Michael. And I was beginning to understand that whatever answer I gave would set the course for the rest of my life. The Kingdom Hall was fuller than usual that morning. Brother Stevens, Michael's father, was delivering the public talk, a 30-minute presentation about the importance of maintaining unity in the congregation. Michael sat in the third row with his family, occasionally glancing in my direction with a small smile that made my chest tighten with something between affection and panic. Unity among God's people has always been one of the distinguishing marks of true worship, Brother Stevens said from the platform, his voice carrying easily through the small auditorium. From Noah's family working together to build the ark, to the first-century Christians sharing all things in common, to Jehovah's Witnesses today preaching the good news in over 240 lands, unity has been essential to accomplishing Jehovah's purposes. Unity, uniformity, conformity to established patterns and expectations. As I listened to the talk, mechanically following along in my Bible when scriptures were cited, I realized that my growing questions and uncertainties were fundamentally about unity. Not whether I believed in it, but whether unity required the complete elimination of individual questioning and exploration. After the public talk ended and we took our 15-minute intermission, I walked outside into the parking lot for some fresh air. Other congregation members stood in small groups discussing the morning's talk or making plans for the afternoon. Children ran between the adults, their formal meeting clothes already showing signs of wear from sitting still for 30 minutes. "Emily," Michael's voice came from behind me. And I turned to see him approaching with that careful smile that had become so familiar over the past few months. "Could we talk for a minute?" We walked to a relatively quiet corner of the parking lot, near the small landscaped area where Sister Martinez grew flowers that she brought inside to decorate the Kingdom Hall during assemblies. The early spring blooms were just beginning to emerge, daffodils and crocuses pushing through the soil, promising warmer weather and longer days ahead. "Emily," Michael said, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "I know the elders spoke with you about us. And I know this puts pressure on you that maybe you weren't expecting." I looked at his face, really looked at him for the first time in weeks. He was handsome in the clean-cut way that witness young men were supposed to be handsome: neat haircut, modest clothing, no facial hair or jewelry or other signs of worldly influence. His eyes were genuinely kind, and when he talked about spiritual things, his enthusiasm was infectious. He would make someone a good husband, a loving father, a faithful companion for the journey toward paradise. But as I stood there in the spring sunshine, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my congregation's Sunday routine, I realized with crystalline clarity that I didn't want him to be my husband. Not because there was anything wrong with him, but because I wasn't ready to be anyone's wife. "Michael," I said slowly, "you're a wonderful person. You really are. But I don't think I'm ready for what courtship means." He nodded, and I could see disappointment flicker across his features before he composed himself. "I understand," he said, "and I respect your honesty. I'd rather know how you really feel than have you go through the motions because it's expected." The bell signaling the end of intermission rang from inside the Kingdom Hall, and we began walking back toward the building. As we reached the entrance, Michael paused and looked at me one more time. "Emily," he said quietly, "I hope you find what you're looking for." The problem was, I was beginning to realize I had no idea what I was looking for. I only knew it wasn't in the carefully mapped life that lay before me like a well-worn path through familiar territory. The Watchtower study that followed felt like a slow march toward judgment. Every comment from the platform, every participation from the audience, every familiar hymn and prayer seemed to underscore the choice I was about to make. When the meeting ended and families began gathering their belongings and making their way toward the parking lot, Brother Davidson appeared at my side. "Emily," he said with his characteristic gentleness, "could you join us in the back room for a few minutes?" This time, the walk to that small office felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff. I knew that when I emerged from that room, my life would be fundamentally different than it had been when I entered. The only question was whether that change would represent growth or loss, freedom or foolishness. The three elders took their same positions around the desk, and I sat in the same metal folding chair I'd occupied 3 days earlier. But everything felt more final this time, more consequential, as if the decision I was about to voice would echo through every remaining day of my life. "Emily," Brother Davidson began, "have you had time to consider what we discussed?" I looked around that small room one more time. The worn carpet, the single high window, the framed picture of Jesus knocking at the door. Then I took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "I've decided that I'm not ready for courtship, with Michael or anyone else. I need more time to figure out what I want from my life." The silence that followed my statement seemed to expand until it filled not just that small room, but the entire building, the entire world. In that silence, I could feel the weight of expectations shifting, traditions being questioned, carefully constructed plans being dismantled. And in that silence, I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the possibility of breathing freely. Brother Williams set his pen down on the yellow legal pad with deliberate precision, the small click of plastic against paper, echoing in the suddenly charged atmosphere of that small room. The fluorescent light above us hummed with a frequency that seemed to match the tension building in my chest, and I could hear the distant sounds of families departing the Kingdom Hall, car doors closing, engines starting, children's voices calling out weekend plans to friends. "Emily," Brother Davidson said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to deliver news that would reshape everything. "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're not just postponing courtship with Brother Stevens. You're saying you're not ready for marriage at all." The distinction felt important, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "Yes," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm not ready for any of it. Not courtship, not marriage, not the life that comes after. I need time to figure out who I am before I can figure out who I want to spend my life with." Brother Chen shifted in his chair, and I could see him exchanging a meaningful glance with Brother Williams. It was the kind of look that passed between elders when they encountered something that didn't fit into their usual categories, something that required consultation with organizational guidelines and careful consideration of biblical principles. "Emily," Brother Chen said, his banker's precision evident in every word, "what you're describing sounds like what the world calls finding yourself. But as Christians, we know that we find our identity in our service to Jehovah, not through worldly exploration or self-discovery." The phrase "finding yourself" hung in the air between us like an accusation. I'd heard it used before, in talks from the platform, always with a dismissive tone that suggested it was a dangerous, selfish concept promoted by Satan's world to lead young people away from their spiritual responsibilities. But sitting there in that small room, facing 3 men who genuinely cared about my spiritual welfare, I realized that finding yourself was exactly what I needed to do. Not in the worldly sense of experimenting with different lifestyles or abandoning my faith, but in the deeper sense of understanding what I believed, what I valued, what I wanted from life beyond the carefully prescribed paths I'd been given. "Brother Chen," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I'm not talking about abandoning my faith or exploring worldly pursuits. I'm talking about understanding what my faith means to me personally, not just what I've been taught it should mean." The silence that followed my statement seemed to expand until it filled not just the room, but the entire building around us. In that silence, I could feel something fundamental shifting, not just in the conversation, but in my understanding of myself and my place within the organization that had shaped every aspect of my life since childhood. Brother Davidson leaned forward slightly, his expression showing genuine concern rather than judgment. Emily, can you help us understand what's brought you to this point? Has someone been influencing your thinking? Have you been reading materials that aren't approved by the organization? The questions were standard ones, the kind of inquiries elders were trained to make when faced with a young person expressing doubts or unconventional ideas. I knew they weren't asking out of suspicion or hostility, but out of a genuine desire to help me return to what they considered the proper spiritual mindset. No one has been influencing me, I said. And I haven't been reading anything inappropriate. This is what I've been thinking about on my own. Brother Williams picked up his pen again and made another note on his legal pad. Emily, independent thinking can be dangerous for young Christians. The Bible warns us not to lean on our own understanding, but to trust in Jehovah's guidance through his organization. Independent thinking. Another phrase I'd heard countless times from the platform, always presented as a spiritual danger to be avoided. Young witnesses were encouraged to be studious and thoughtful, but within carefully defined boundaries. We were supposed to think deeply about organizational teachings and biblical principles, but not to question or examine those teachings critically. But what if questioning wasn't the same as rejecting? What if examining beliefs critically could actually strengthen faith rather than weaken it? What if the organization's fear of independent thinking was itself a sign that something was wrong with the system? Brother Williams, I said, feeling my way through thoughts I'd never voiced before. If our beliefs are true, shouldn't they be able to withstand questions? Shouldn't investigation and examination make them stronger, not weaker? The three men exchanged another round of meaningful glances, and I could see that my questions were moving the conversation into territory they found deeply troubling. These weren't the kind of doubts that could be resolved with a few encouraging scriptures and reminders about trusting in Jehovah's timing. These were fundamental questions about authority, truth, and the role of individual conscience in matters of faith. Brother Davidson stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at something I couldn't see from my position. When he turned back to face me, his expression had changed from concern to something more serious, more final. Emily, he said, I think we need to be very clear about where this conversation is leading. The path you're describing, questioning organizational authority, prioritizing personal feelings over established biblical principles, refusing to accept the guidance we're offering. This isn't the path of a faithful Christian. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were pressing closer. I realized that what had begun as a conversation about courtship and marriage had become something much more significant, a judgment about my spiritual condition and my standing in the congregation. What are you saying? I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what they were saying. Brother Chen answered with the careful precision I'd come to expect from him. We're saying that the attitude you're expressing is concerning. It shows a lack of submission to theocratic authority and a dangerous reliance on your own wisdom rather than God's guidance through his organization. And, Brother Williams added, we're concerned that this attitude might influence other young people in the congregation. Doubt and questioning can be contagious, Emily. We have a responsibility to protect the flock from anything that might stumble others. The weight of their words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I was no longer just a 19-year-old girl trying to figure out her life. I had become a potential threat to the spiritual welfare of the entire congregation. Someone whose questions and uncertainties could spread like a disease and infect other young witnesses with dangerous ideas about independence and personal choice. So what happens now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Brother Davidson returned to his seat and folded his hands on the desk before him. Now, we give you time to reconsider your position. We are going to recommend that you limit your participation in congregation activities for a while. No commenting at meetings, no privileges like reading or demonstrations, no involvement in field service groups with young people. "You're marking me," I said, using the organizational term for the practice of identifying potentially dangerous individuals and limiting their association with other congregation members. "We're being cautious," Brother Chen corrected. "This is for your own spiritual protection, as well as the protection of others. Sometimes when young people are going through spiritual difficulties, limiting their activities helps them focus on what's really important." I looked around that small room one final time, taking in the details that had become so familiar over the past week. The worn carpet, the single high window, the framed picture of Jesus knocking at the door. But now, these details felt different, like props in a play I no longer wanted to participate in. "And if I don't reconsider my position?" I asked. "If I continue to believe that I have the right to think for myself and make my own decisions about my life?" The silence that followed my question was the heaviest yet. It stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged, representing the fundamental incompatibility between my growing desire for personal autonomy and the organization's requirement for complete submission. Brother Davidson was the one who finally spoke, his voice gentle but absolutely final. "Then, Emily, we would have to consider whether you truly belong in Jehovah's organization at all." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. To be told that I might not belong in the only community I'd ever known, among the only people I'd ever considered family, because I wanted to think for myself and make my own choices, it was devastating and liberating at the same time. I stood up slowly, my legs surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of what had just transpired. "I understand," I said. "And I want you to know that I don't take this lightly. But I can't pretend to believe things I don't believe, and I can't accept guidance that feels wrong in my heart, even if it comes from people I respect." As I walked toward the door of that small room, my hand on the handle that would take me back into the main auditorium of the Kingdom Hall, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The terrifying, exhilarating sensation of breathing freely. Behind me, I could hear Brother Davidson's voice, sad but resolute. "Emily, we'll be praying for you. We hope you'll reconsider before it's too late." I paused with my hand on the door handle, looking back at three men who had genuinely tried to help me according to their understanding of what help meant. "Thank you," I said. "But I think I'm finally ready to start helping myself." The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like the end of one life and the beginning of another. The walk from the Kingdom Hall back room to the main auditorium felt like traversing an enormous distance, though it couldn't have been more than 20 feet. My legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from the strange lightness that comes when you realize you've just stepped across a threshold that can never be uncrossed. The main auditorium was nearly empty now, just a few families gathering their belongings and children who had fallen asleep during the Watchtower study. My parents stood near our usual seats in the fourth row, my mother's purse clutched tightly in her hands, my father checking his watch as if measuring how long the elders' conversation with me had taken. When they saw me emerge from the back room, I could read the anxiety in their faces, the particular kind of worry that comes when you know something important has happened, but you're not sure whether it's good or catastrophic. "Emily," my mother said softly as I approached them. "How did it go, honey?" I looked at her face, really looked at it, taking in the lines around her eyes that had deepened over the past few years. The careful way she held herself, the dress she'd pressed especially for today's meeting. This woman had dedicated her entire adult life to the organization, had raised me within its boundaries, had shaped her identity around being a faithful witness, wife, and mother. How could I tell her that I just rejected everything she'd taught me was most important? "We'll talk about it at home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not ready to discuss it here." The ride home in our family's aging Buick was filled with the kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken questions. My father drove with his usual careful precision, checking his mirrors, signaling well before turns, observing the speed limit exactly. My mother sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at me with worried eyes. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood. The Henderson's house, with the flower garden my mother always admired. The corner grocery store, where I'd bought penny candy as a child. The small park where I'd played on swings before I was old enough to understand that celebrating birthdays was wrong. Everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time through different eyes. These were the streets where I'd grown up believing I was part of a special, chosen people. Now they just looked like ordinary streets in an ordinary small town where ordinary people lived ordinary lives without the weight of constantly measuring themselves against impossible standards of spiritual perfection. When we reached our house, the modest ranch home where I'd lived for 19 years, my parents and I sat around our familiar kitchen table. But instead of the morning worship routine that usually brought us together in this space, we faced each other across an expanse that felt wider than any ocean. "Emily," my father said carefully, "we need to understand what happened with the elders. Your mother and I are concerned." I took a deep breath, gathering courage from somewhere I didn't know existed. I told them I'm not ready for courtship with Michael, or with anyone. I need time to figure out what I want from my life before I make that kind of commitment. My mother's face went pale. "Emily, honey, what do you mean you need to figure out what you want? We know what Jehovah wants for faithful young women: marriage, family, service to the organization. That's the path to happiness and eternal life." "But what if I want something different?" I asked, the words feeling strange but liberating as they left my mouth. "What if I want to go to college, or travel, or have a career, or just understand who I am as a person before I become someone's wife?" The silence that followed my question was deafening. My parents exchanged the kind of look that passes between people who've been married for decades, a whole conversation happening in a glance. I could see them trying to process not just my words, but the fundamental challenge to everything they'd believed about proper Christian living that those words represented. "Emily," my father said finally, "those are worldly desires. Satan uses education and career ambitions to draw young people away from their spiritual responsibilities. You've been baptized for 7 years. You know better than this." "Do I?" I asked, surprising myself with my directness. "Or have I just been accepting what I've been told without really thinking about whether it's what I believe?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Honey, where is this coming from? Have you been talking to someone? Reading something that's influenced your thinking?" The assumption that my questions must be coming from outside influence rather than my own reflection stung. But I was beginning to understand that this was how the organization trained people to think. Independent thought was so dangerous, so unlikely, that it must always be the result of external corruption rather than internal growth. "No, Mom," I said gently. "This is just me, thinking for myself about what I want my life to look like." Over the following days, the reality of my situation began to crystallize in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The elders had made good on their warning about limiting my participation in congregation activities. When Tuesday evening's theocratic ministry school meeting arrived, I sat in my usual seat but was not called upon for any of the student presentations I'd been scheduled to give. When Thursday's meeting came, my hand remained unacknowledged each time I raised it to comment during the Watchtower study. But the most painful change was in the way other congregation members began treating me. Sister Martha, who had been my field service partner just the week before, gave me a polite but distant nod when we passed in the grocery store. The young families I'd known since childhood suddenly found reasons to end conversations when I approached. Even the teenagers who had looked up to me as an example of faithful young womanhood began avoiding eye contact. I was being marked just as the elders had promised. Not formally announced or explicitly explained, but marked nonetheless, identified as someone whose association might be spiritually dangerous, someone whose questions and doubts could spread like a contagion to others who might be vulnerable to similar thinking. The isolation was more painful than I'd expected. For 19 years, the congregation had been my entire social world. Every friendship, every meaningful relationship, every sense of belonging and community had been centered around our shared faith and shared commitment to the organization. Now I was watching all of that slip away, not through any dramatic confrontation or public scandal, but through the quiet, systematic withdrawal of love and acceptance that the organization used to maintain control over its members. But alongside the pain of isolation came something unexpected. Clarity. For the first time in my life, I was free to explore thoughts and feelings without constantly measuring them against organizational expectations. I began reading books from the public library. Not forbidden literature, but novels and histories and philosophy texts that had never been on my reading list because they weren't directly related to spiritual study. I started taking long walks through parts of town I'd never explored, observing how other families lived, how other young people my age spent their time, what life looked like outside the carefully bounded world I'd always known. Most surprisingly, I began praying differently. Instead of the formal, structured prayers I'd been taught, always thanking Jehovah for his organization, always requesting help to be more faithful, always ending with the prescribed acknowledgement of Christ's mediating role. I found myself having conversations with God that felt more like actual conversations. I asked questions without apologizing for asking them. I expressed doubts without immediately feeling guilty for having them. I talked about my fears and hopes and dreams without filtering everything through organizational doctrine. And in those conversations, I began to sense something I'd never experienced before, the possibility that God might actually want me to think for myself, to explore, to grow, to become the person I was meant to be, rather than simply conforming to the person the organization told me I should be. 3 weeks after my conversation with the elders, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped attending meetings altogether. Not as a dramatic gesture of rebellion, but simply because sitting in those familiar seats, listening to talks that increasingly felt hollow and restrictive, had become more painful than liberating. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what I actually believed rather than what I'd been told to believe. The reaction from my parents was swift and agonizing. My father, who had served as a ministerial servant for over a decade, was suddenly faced with the humiliation of having a daughter who was publicly rejecting the organization. My mother, whose entire identity was wrapped up in being a faithful pioneer and example to other women in the congregation, felt as if her own spiritual standing was being questioned. "Emily," she said one evening as we sat in our living room, the same room where I'd first studied with Sister Rosa and Sister Margaret years earlier, "if you don't go back to the meetings, the elders will have no choice but to disfellowship you. You'll lose everything. Your family, your friends, your hope of eternal life. Is whatever you think you're looking for really worth that price?" I looked around that familiar room. The simple furniture my parents had chosen carefully within their modest budget. The family photos that showed our progression through the years, always dressed in our best meeting clothes, always smiling the kind of careful smiles that suggested happiness without revealing too much joy. On the bookshelf sat the collection of Watchtower and Awake magazines my mother saved, the bound volumes of annual publications, the various books and brochures that had shaped my understanding of truth and morality and proper Christian living. "Mom," I said, feeling simultaneously like a child and like an adult for the first time in my life, "I don't know what I'm looking for yet. But I know that living a life that doesn't feel authentic to who I am isn't really living at all." The conversation that followed was the most honest one my parents and I had ever had. For the first time, I told them about the doubts I'd been harboring, the questions that had been growing in my mind, the feeling that I'd been trying to fit into a mold that wasn't shaped for who I really was. For the first time, they talked about their own struggles with faith, their own moments of doubt, their own sacrifices and losses along the path of faithful living. But even in that honesty, the fundamental divide remained. They had found peace and purpose within the organization's structure, even when it required sacrifice and submission. I was discovering that I needed something different. Not necessarily better or worse, but different in ways that the organization couldn't accommodate. As April dissolved into May, and my absence from meetings became a settled pattern rather than a temporary rebellion, I began building what felt like the first authentic life I'd ever lived. I found a job at a local bookstore, spending my days surrounded by ideas and stories and perspectives I'd never been exposed to. I began forming friendships with coworkers and customers who knew nothing about my religious background and liked me simply for who I was becoming. Most importantly, I began understanding that leaving the organization didn't mean abandoning faith, but rather discovering what faith meant to me personally, rather than what it was supposed to mean according to someone else's interpretation. The formal disfellowshipping announcement came in June, delivered with the same calm authority that characterized all official congregation business. Emily Richardson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, the presiding overseer announced during the service meeting, followed by the standard warning that faithful congregation members should limit their association with me to necessary family business only. But by then, the announcement felt more like a confirmation of a journey I'd already begun than a judgment I needed to fear. I was no longer the 19-year-old girl who had sat in that back room 3 months earlier, terrified of disappointing the elders. I was becoming someone new, someone who could think independently, choose freely, and build a life based on my own understanding of what was right, rather than what I'd been told was right. The woman I was becoming still had questions about faith, purpose, and meaning. But now, those questions felt like doorways to exploration rather than signs of spiritual failure. 10 years have passed since that June afternoon when Brother Davidson's voice echoed through the Kingdom Hall, announcing that Emily Richardson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 10 years that have taken me from a confused 19-year-old girl questioning everything she'd been taught to a 29-year-old woman who has finally learned to breathe freely in a life built on her own choices rather than someone else's expectations. I'm writing this from my small apartment near the university campus, where I completed my bachelor's degree in social work 3 years ago. The morning sunlight streams through windows that I chose, illuminating furniture I selected, books I bought because they interested me rather than because they were approved by an organization. On my kitchen table sits a cup of coffee, the same ritual I once imagined might exist in paradise. But now I understand that paradise isn't a future promise contingent on organizational loyalty. Paradise is the peace that comes from living authentically, the joy of relationships built on genuine affection rather than shared doctrine, the satisfaction of work that serves people rather than institutions. The bookstore job that began as necessity became a passion that led me to discover my calling in helping others navigate difficult transitions in their lives. My degree in social work opened doors to employment with a non-profit organization that specializes in supporting individuals leaving high-control religious groups. It's work that feels like the first genuine ministry I've ever engaged in. Not knocking on doors to recruit people into an organization, but standing alongside people as they find their own paths toward healing and freedom. The relationships I've built over these 10 years are different from anything I experienced in the Kingdom Hall. My friendship with Sarah, my former co-worker at the bookstore, is based on shared interests in literature and social justice rather than shared religious beliefs. My relationship with David, the man I've been dating for 2 years, is founded on mutual respect, open communication, and the understanding that we're both individuals choosing to build something together rather than conforming to predetermined roles. My connection with my supervisor, Maria Tanaz, has grown from professional collaboration into personal mentorship as she's guided me through the challenges of working with people who've experienced religious trauma. These relationships aren't conditional on my behavior meeting certain standards or my beliefs aligning with specific doctrines. They're based on the simple recognition that I'm a human being worthy of love and respect, regardless of my spiritual journey or personal choices. When I make mistakes, and I've made plenty over these 10 years, these people don't withdraw their affection or threaten to cut me off unless I conform. They talk with me, support me, and help me learn and grow. The hardest part of these 10 years has been navigating the loss of my family relationships. My parents, bound by organizational directives about associating with disfellowshipped individuals, have maintained only the most minimal contact necessary for essential family business. I've seen them briefly at my grandmother's funeral, exchanged stiff pleasantries at chance encounters in grocery stores, received birthday cards with carefully neutral messages that avoid any expression of approval for my life choices. But even this pain has taught me important lessons about unconditional love versus conditional approval. The love my parents expressed for me while I was a faithful witness was real, but it was also contingent on my continued membership in good standing with the organization. The friends I thought I'd lost forever when I left were actually friends I'd never truly had, because our friendship was based on shared organizational loyalty rather than genuine personal connection. Learning to distinguish between love and approval, between authentic relationship and institutional obligation, has been one of the most valuable skills I've developed. It's a skill I now help others develop as they navigate their own transitions away from high-control environments. The spiritual journey has been the most surprising aspect of these 10 years. Leaving the organization didn't mean abandoning faith as I'd been taught to expect. Instead, it meant discovering what faith means to me personally, rather than what someone else told me it should mean. I've explored different religious traditions, read theological works that were once forbidden, engaged in conversations about spirituality with people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives. What I've discovered is that the God I relate to now is larger, more compassionate, and more accepting than the deity presented in Watchtower literature. This God doesn't require membership in a specific organization for salvation. This God doesn't demand unquestioning obedience to human leaders. This God values questions, appreciates growth, and meets people where they are rather than where they're supposed to be according to someone else's standards. My prayer life has become more honest, more conversational, more authentic. Instead of reciting formulaic expressions designed to demonstrate proper spiritual attitude, I find myself talking to God about real concerns, genuine gratitude, authentic struggles. I ask questions without fear of punishment. I express doubts without shame. I share hopes and dreams that don't fit into organizational categories of appropriate spiritual goals. This relationship with the divine feels more real, more personal, more sustaining than anything I experienced during my 19 years as an active witness. It's a faith that supports my growth as an individual rather than demanding my conformity to institutional expectations. The work I do now with people leaving high-control religious groups has shown me that my experience, while painful, was not unique. Every week, I meet individuals who've struggled with the same conflicts between personal authenticity and organizational demands that I experienced. Former members of various religious movements, Jehovah's Witnesses, fundamentalist Christian churches, Islamic extremist groups, Hindu cults, New Age communities, all share remarkably similar stories of manipulation, control, and the courage required to choose freedom over security. Each person I work with teaches me something new about resilience, about the human capacity for growth and change, about the strength required to rebuild a life from scratch when everything familiar has been lost. I've learned that trauma can become a source of wisdom, that pain can be transformed into compassion, that the very experiences that nearly destroyed us can become the foundation for helping others find their own paths to healing. Last month, I received a letter that reminded me why this work matters so much. It was from a young woman named Jessica, who had attended a support group I facilitated 2 years earlier. She'd been struggling with the decision to leave her fundamentalist church, terrified of losing her family and her entire social support system. Emily, she wrote, I wanted you to know that I finally found the courage to leave. It's been 6 months now, and while it's been harder than I expected, it's also been more liberating than I imagined. I have a job I love, friends who accept me for who I am, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living my own life rather than someone else's idea of what my life should be. I wanted to thank you for showing me that it was possible to survive leaving. and even to thrive afterward. Stories like Jessica's remind me that the pain of my own journey has purpose beyond my personal growth. Every difficult moment, every tear shed, every relationship lost has contributed to my ability to understand and support others facing similar transitions. The girl who sat in that Kingdom Hall back room 10 years ago, terrified of disappointing the elders, has become a woman who can help others find courage to choose authenticity over approval. As I look toward the future, I feel a sense of anticipation that was impossible during my years as a witness. Then the future was predetermined. Marriage, family, organizational service, waiting for Armageddon. Now, the future is full of possibilities I get to choose. I might pursue graduate education in counseling psychology. David and I might decide to marry and start a family together. I might write a book about religious trauma and recovery. I might travel to places that were once forbidden because they were associated with worldly education or culture. The difference is that these possibilities are mine to explore, mine to choose, mine to change, if they don't work out as expected. For the first time in my life, I'm the author of my own story, rather than a character in someone else's narrative. To anyone reading this who might be struggling with similar questions about faith, control, and authentic living, I want to offer the same encouragement that others offered me during my darkest moments. You are not alone. Your questions are valid. Your desire for freedom is natural and healthy. The fear you feel about leaving what's familiar is normal, but it doesn't have to paralyze you. There is life beyond the boundaries of high-control organizations. There is love beyond conditional approval. There is faith beyond institutional membership. There is peace beyond perfect conformity. The journey to find these things is difficult, but it's possible, and it's worth every struggle along the way. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is trust your own conscience, ask your own questions, and choose your own path forward. Sometimes the most faithful response to doubt is investigation rather than suppression. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is refuse to pretend that destructive patterns are acceptable just because they're familiar. Your life belongs to you. Your choices are yours to make. Your relationship with the divine is yours to cultivate. No organization, no matter how convinced of its own authority, has the right to determine your worth, direct your conscience, or control your destiny. The freedom to breathe authentically, to love unconditionally, to grow continuously, and to choose consciously is a gift available to anyone brave enough to claim it. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with your experience. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.